To all of you, especially Dr. Arvind Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, Dr. Muthukumara, one of the authors of the report, and then we have a technical session after the inaugural, and there's speakers here and the moderator. So thank you all very much for coming. You have all the names of the speakers in your folder, so you can have a look at that and their bios as well. And really, thank you very much for coming to this launch of the World Bank Regional Flagship Report on South Asia's Hotspots, the impact of temperature and precipitation changes on living standards. I don't think we need to be persuaded of the importance of this topic. Not in India, definitely, not in ICRIER, and certainly not in the policy community and the think tanks, not only in Delhi, but across India and across South Asia. I think this is a very important topic, and therefore we are very happy and privileged to be launching this report, the Regional Flagship Report, in collaboration with the World Bank in ICRIER, and thank Dr. Arvind Subramanian to take out time from his busy schedule to actually come and give us the keynote address. I'm not going to take too much time in the beginning, but I just want to make a couple of points before Mani makes the presentation, and then following that, Arvind will make his keynote remarks. So there's a slight change from the sequence that you see in your folder. So we'll let Mani present so that Arvind can actually hear what he has to say and then also react to it. As I said, I just want to make a couple of remarks, both about ICRIER and about the topic. And this flows from a lot of the work that ICRIER has been doing on climate change since 2013. And one of the main results of this report that you will see, the report, by the way, is available online. We will be launching sort of an executive or the main results after the inaugural session. One of the main results of the report is that GDP in India by 2050 will be affected 2.8% in case we don't do things to arrest the tide. So the business as usual scenario will give us a loss of 2.8% due to climate events and weather patterns. And some of the manifestations of this result are clear to us. We keep hearing about this, on agriculture, on labor, on productivity, on water, and water is particularly in the recent past has been a theme for a lot of research in ICRIER, and I'll say a few words about that. But just a broad, big sort of point on the nature of the result and the magnitude of the result. I mean, 2.8% may seem very high, and it could mean that policymakers will say, look, this is a very high result. The magnitude is extremely high. 2.8% is a large number of GDP, and India's GDP in 2050 will be 10 trillion plus. So this is a large number. So it's easy to dismiss it and say, this is an alarmist result. While the authors may not intend it that way, it is quite possible that it could just be that there's nothing we can really do about it, so let it be. I don't think that's what the authors intend, nor what sort of ICRIER intends, is that despite the fact that it is a very high number and it raises alarm bells. I mean, just like you must have heard last year, that there was a lot of talk about 69 to 70% of jobs in India are at risk because of technology. I mean, that rings the alarm bells. But I think this result, that is also an alarmist result, but that doesn't mean you don't need to do anything about it. And I think we should begin to address the problem now. So that's the first thing. We should look at the magnitude, not in terms of the actual number, but in terms of the qualitative result, that these are massive changes that are going to happen unless we do something to arrest the tide. So that's really the first point I wanted to make. The second point is that, as I said, ICRIER has been engaged a lot in this sort of research on climate change, especially sectoral impacts on jobs, on agriculture. And as I was saying, that one of the reports that we released just a couple of weeks ago in the Habitat Center related to water stress. And it's a result that we've been talking about quite a long time. The report also does talk about water-stressed regions, especially central India. Vidarbha is named in the report. And there are crops that are grown in that region. It's a water-stressed region. There are crops that are grown. And we know the misallocation of geographical locations or cropping patterns in India are misallocated in the sense that water-intensive crops are grown in water-stressed regions. Of course, it's not difficult to sort of change the system. There are structural problems, but it's important to begin to discourse and discuss these results so that change, as and when it does happen, is on the basis of evidence, on the basis of discussions, which in India is the norm. So we need to encourage this public discourse and discussion. And then, of course, the result on jobs, living conditions, the report highlights all of that. And really, the result is something that doesn't come as a surprise. I mean, the results are going to be large. And we need to address it for our own reason. Of course, we can be miffed and outraged at the West for lack of cooperation and the lack of technological and financial flows based on what they had committed in the past. We can be outraged at that, but for our own sake, and we can continue those negotiations, but for our own sake, we need to begin to address these issues now, because as the difference between countries, the West, the rich countries will be able to adapt and will be more resilient to climate change. Within the country, there are people who will be much more vulnerable. The report talks about growing inequalities, and therefore the growing number of poor people who would be affected by climate change is disproportionately higher, because the rich could find ways to adapt to changing circumstances. So I think it's important, and therefore for policy, not only for better policy, for better implementation, that we have good evidence. And I'm very happy that World Bank has again partnered with ICRIER. We've done a number of reports, launches, and research projects jointly with the World Bank, and this is in continuation with a collaboration that dates back for many, many years. And I think we have been able to make a difference to the policy discourse within the country. So without taking too much of your time, and warmly welcoming all of you to this important event, especially Dr. Arvind Subramanian and Dr. Mani, for sparing the time and coming here. But as I said, as a departure from the sequence, may I request Dr. Mani to make a brief presentation, about 15 minutes for the report, and then we'll have the keynote address. So thank you all very much for coming, and Dr. Mani.
Thanks, Rajat. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be presenting the findings of our flagship report. Many thanks to Dr. Arvind Subramanian for kindly agreeing to be the keynote speaker at this event. And again, thanks to Rajat and ICRIER for kindly organizing this event for us. And we are very glad that you have turned out in such large numbers. And I hope you will find these findings interesting and useful. So just to, for starters, we all know that South Asia is highly vulnerable to climate change. If you take any global indicator, you'll always find South Asian countries featuring in the top 5, 10 in terms of either extreme heat or extreme flooding events and so on and so forth. But South Asia is also, we know that is at the epicenter of another global challenge, that is in terms of sheer number of poor people. Although South Asian region, as a region, has made tremendous progress in the last couple of years because of their economic growth in terms of reducing number of people below the poverty line, but still it remains to be a big challenge. So if you combine climate change with the need to improve living standards of people, clearly you need to understand better how climate change is to impact the economies and how we need to solve some of these problems. We know that countries acknowledge this as a major problem. They all have formulated climate change action plans, strategies, both the national and subnational level. And they all of them have signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, and they have submitted their INDCs and so on and so forth. So clearly, countries understand that climate change is a major challenge, and they need to deal with it, especially to meet their growth and poverty reduction objectives. But it's easy to formulate action plans and strategies, but difficult to implement because it's going to cost. And then you have to make trade-offs between investing for climate versus investing in other your development priorities like education, health, and so on and so forth. So there are trade-offs between climate and non-climate. And within climate, you have to decide where to invest, when to invest, how much to invest, and so on and so forth. Whether you invest in climate today or you postpone that decision 10 years from now, maybe you have a better information about climate change and how it's going to impact you. So clearly, policymakers are faced with this challenge of implementing the action plans that they have formulated in great detail. But in order to make these decisions, economic decisions, obviously they need more information. They need to come up with an economic rationale in terms of costs and benefits, and also based on that, they need to prioritize today in terms of where to invest, when to invest, how much to invest. Now, people talk of South Asia as being a monolith in terms of climate change, and South Asia is a climate hotspot. That's not always true because South Asia's climate is fairly diverse. You have regions that are really cold, which actually may benefit from climate change. There are regions that are slightly warmer, and there are regions that are fairly hot, right? So the impact of climate change is also going to be fairly diverse given the diversity within, the climatic diversity within the region. Similarly, if you look in terms of monsoon precipitation patterns, clearly there are regions that are dry, there are regions that are quite wet, and so on and so forth. So clearly, again, when you think in terms of climate change, you need to understand that it's going to have differential impact across the different parts of South Asia. But if you look in terms of the last 60 years or so, you find that temperatures have been slowly creeping up, have increased to about, almost up to 3 degrees in some areas, average annual temperatures. But in most areas, it's gone up from 0.5 to 1 degrees, which is a lot of increase, especially when you think of occupations like agriculture and so on and so forth. But you don't see a whole lot of a pattern in terms of average monsoon rainfall. There are some areas that have become wetter, some areas become drier, but overall we don't see the kind of pattern that we see in case of temperature. Just like as I said, South Asia is not a monolith. Climate change is not a monolith because climate change has different manifestations. One is these extreme events. You have these cyclones, extreme flooding events in urban areas, coastal areas, and so on and so forth, that destroy property, human life, and so on and so forth. And then there is sea level rise. That's something that's going to happen 50 years from now. That's going to flood our coastal areas, coastal cities, and so on and so forth. And then there is change, gradual change in the average temperature and rainfall pattern that's going to happen, and that's happening, and that's going to impact your agricultural productivity, health, labor productivity, maybe even impact migration patterns, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of the focus in climate change has been on extreme events because that's more visible. Like tomorrow, if you say there's going to be a flood in Jammu Kashmir, you will hear about floods for a long time, and then the government will take measures to deal with these floods. And we know that what needs to be done to deal with the extreme events. You either move people out of the way, or you introduce early warning system, or you build embankments, you change the pattern of the rivers, and so on and so forth. So you kind of know the drill based on the exposure, hazard, vulnerability framework that's been practiced for a long time. Sea level rise, that's something that's a long-term challenge which we need to worry about, but at least for now, we can say that that's not going to happen 50 years from now. Maybe at that time, we need to protect our coastal areas, enforce building codes, enforce zoning plans, maybe build seawalls, embankments, and so on. But what's really we know less about is this slow-moving disaster that's been happening, the average annual temperature that are slowly creeping up. And even a 1 degree increase in temperature could make a huge difference if you're an agricultural farmer. You have to decide planting one crop versus the other. Or if monsoon shifts by 2 weeks, that could again make a huge difference in terms of how you design your agricultural practice. Similarly, 1 degree increase in temperature could make a huge difference if you are a laborer in a city, right, working in construction. So this is one area where we feel that there is a knowledge gap in terms of trying to understand how this slow-moving disaster is going to impact our long-term growth and poverty reduction challenges. So basically in this report, what we address is we address 3 questions: where these average changes will happen, and who will be most impacted, and what needs to be done to build resilience. So first of all, we needed to understand how the climate is going to change in the next 30, 50 years. So we commissioned a group of top climate scientists and asked them to give us the models that best fit South Asia. Because South Asia, the climate models, the global climate models, there are about 50 models out there, all giving different projections in terms of temperature and rainfall patterns. But we wanted those models that best fit South Asia in terms of the future projections. And we were interested in 2 scenarios, one which we call climate-sensitive scenario, and other which we call carbon-intensive scenario. The basic difference in layman terms is climate-sensitive scenario is if countries comply with the Paris Agreement and implement some of the Paris goals. And carbon-intensive scenario is business as usual. In other words, if Paris falls apart and then countries go about their own ways in terms of carbon emissions. So we were able to then project what happens to the temperature and precipitation patterns under both these scenarios. Under both these scenarios, temperature will continue to increase. There is still some uncertainty in terms of the precipitation patterns that we observe in terms of the model projections. So if you look at the 2 scenarios, obviously you see here that under the carbon-intensive scenario, in other words, if Paris breaks down and if it's business as usual, large part of South Asia will experience up to 2 to 2.5 degree increase by middle of the century, right? Whereas if Paris is complied with, countries implement some of the commitments, obviously the impact will be less stressful for the South Asia region. But again, in terms of the precipitation patterns, we don't see too much of a story in terms of future projections. There'll be some areas that will become wetter, some areas will be drier, but overall we feel that temperature will be the main driving force. And that's not been paid much attention to in the literature in terms of its impact on the economies. So we wanted to look at how climate change will impact living standards at the household level. So we compiled a whole lot of climate data, both historic and future climate data, at a fairly granular level, going down to the level of the districts. And we had this huge data set going down to the level of households, right? So we want to understand, overlay the climate with household level data to understand how climate impacts household living standards, which is defined as consumption expenditure in our study. There could be different pathways by which climate will impact your living standard. It may be through health, it may be through reduction in agricultural productivity, it may be through migration, maybe forcing you to move out of your comfort zone, or it may be through decline in labor productivity. So there are different channels by which climate change will impact your living standards, but we were mainly interested in the bottom line in terms of how climate change will affect your household consumption expenditure across time. So our first part of our analysis was to understand where we are in terms of the various tipping points for countries. Now, how do we define these tipping points? Basically, there is now a growing literature which suggests that there is a kind of inverse relationship between temperature and productivity. In other words, productivity increases up to a certain point, and beyond that increase in temperature, productivity starts to go down. It's like an inverted U-shaped relationship. So we wanted to find out if there is a similar inverse relationship between temperature and consumption patterns. And when we did that analysis, we found that, in fact, we do get an inverted U-shaped relationship. And unfortunately, in terms of tipping points, we find that most of the South Asian countries are already beyond the tipping points. In other words, at the national level, they're already beyond the point where any further increase in temperature is going to only lead to decline in consumption expenditure, except for Nepal, which is actually going to benefit from future increases in temperature, and Afghanistan, which is almost at the midpoint. So for countries like India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, you find that majority of population is already living in areas that are already being adversely impacted and will only get further impacted as temperature goes to increase. So when we did this analysis, then we find obviously that the decline in living standards will be negative for almost all countries except for Nepal and Afghanistan. But I think it's important to note here that, as Rajat was mentioning, it's good to know these national aggregates, right? GDP is going to decline by 2.8%, or consumption is going to decline by 2.8%. But that doesn't really tell us much in terms of what needs to be done. So that was our starting point of our analysis, in the sense that we needed this number to make sure that our findings are somewhat similar to other studies that have been done at the national level. And it was comforting to know that we are not way off the mark. But at the same time, 2.8% of GDP, for example, loss is useful, but for a policymaker, I don't think it's awfully useful, except for, as Rajat was saying, it is sounding alarm bells, but then what he or she needs to do, we don't know about it. That's why we went down further. Since we had a fairly granular data at the household level, we were able to drill down to understand how the impacts are going to go down to the district level or even to the household level. So we define hotspots as areas where living standards will decline by more than 8%. Moderate hotspots are areas where living standards will decline from 4 to 8%, and mild hotspots where the living standards will decline more than 4%. So we were able to plot areas within South Asia which will be most impacted. And as you can see here, in the worst case scenario, under the carbon intensive scenario, we find that there'll be a lot more severe hotspots than under the climate sensitive scenario, which obviously means that a lot is stake for South Asia in protecting Paris Agreement, in making sure that countries comply with Paris Agreement and not allowing it to break down. And if you look at India, for example, you'll see that central parts of India is something that's going to be most impacted. Now, again, I want to point out here that often when people talk of climate hotspots, people talk of Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata, Dhaka, and Karachi as being climate hotspots. Because at that time, you're only thinking of extreme events, sea level rise, and so on and so forth. Nobody would talk of Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan as climate hotspot. But what we find here is that if you look at the slow-moving disaster that's happening over the last 50, 60 years, and that's continued to going to happen, you find that the central part of India is the one that's going to be most impacted. So we can actually drill down to come up with the most top 10, let's say, for example, worst districts in these countries. If you look at Bangladesh, for example, Cox's Bazar is the worst impacted district. And if you remember, Cox's Bazar is now, again, at a social boiling point with millions of Rohingya refugees pouring in, right? Similarly, in Sri Lanka, we find that northern and north-central parts of Sri Lanka are most impacted. For example, Jaffna, Puttalam, Kalinochi, and so on and so forth. These are, again, areas that are just coming out of civil war, and there'll be a double whammy in terms of their climate impacts as well. In India, interestingly, we found that 7 of the top 10 districts are from just one region, which is the Vidarbha region of Maharashtra. That, again, was interesting because in such a big country like India, we are thinking that the hotspots will be all over the place, but actually we find the top 10 hotspot districts are in Vidarbha, and we all know that Vidarbha has been in the news for the last few years because of the agricultural stress that the farmers are going through. And interestingly, in Pakistan, we find that some of the cities like Lahore, Multan, and Faisalabad, they are coming up with hotspots, not necessarily agricultural regions as in most other countries. So basically, we can go down and come up with the top states that will be most impacted. As I said, there will be Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra. Interestingly, Jharkhand will be the most impacted in India. Similarly, one can come up with the top 10 districts. I mean, we have data for all the districts, but I'm just showing here the top 10 worst impacted districts. So now that we have this hotspot data for across all these countries, thousands and thousands of areas, we wanted to find out, is there any similarity between these hotspots? We find that some of the things that are common across hotspots they all are less developed. In other words, in terms of poorer infrastructure, they're all poorer access to markets, and they all are many of them are water stressed. So these are some of the commonalities between the hotspot districts across all the countries. Similarly, we wanted to find out what is common in terms of the households across these hotspots. We find that predominantly in most countries, the households, most impacted households are agricultural households and also the households which have poorer access to electricity. At the same time, we also wanted to find out, are there any significant differences between these hotspots across these countries? For example, we find that in some countries, especially in Pakistan, we find that rural districts are not necessarily hotspot. It is urban areas that are coming out to be hotspots. Similarly, in Bangladesh, we find that agricultural regions or agricultural households are not hotspots. It's actually non-agricultural households who are most impacted by hotspots. Similarly, and the other interesting result was that women-headed households we find are far more resilient to climate change than overall in most countries. So again, the question, going back to our question, is how is it going to impact the economies? Again, as I mentioned before, if you look just at the number for the national number of 2.8%, it's misleading because it just kind of it hides some of the underlying issues, especially, for example, if you look at the loss of GDP in hotspot districts, it's almost 10%, right? So I think what we really want to stress here is that we need to really drill down to understand the location-specific impact of climate change. Looking at these national numbers, it only helps in terms of sounding alarm bells, but I think what we really need to do, as we found in this report, is to look at the location-specific impact and, in terms of GDP loss and decline in living standards. So now that we have this number, the question is, what do we do to make these communities resilient? Of course, we can talk of making agriculture more climate smart, maybe improving cropping practices, improving irrigation, reducing water stress, and so on and so forth. But we also wanted to find out, between now and 2050, a lot of things are going to happen. People may argue that the economies are going to develop, people will be more educated, infrastructure will be more, more modern, more resilient, and so on and so forth. So we just wanted to find out what measures can governments take, or what measures will actually lessen the climate burden on these communities. For example, in India, we just looked at 3 policy choices: creating more non-agricultural jobs, reducing water stress, and enhancing educational attainment by 30%. We just wanted to find out how will these impact the climate impact. And we were able to see that these 3 measures in themselves will reduce about 1 percentage point from the climate burden. In other words, from 2.8, you almost go to 1.9% in terms of, it shaves off almost 1% climate impact that the countries will experience. Similarly, in Bangladesh, in fact, we find that creating jobs in the non-agricultural sector will actually make them go from negative to positive in terms of improving climate resilience. In Pakistan, we find that improving access to electricity will reduce the climate burden. In Sri Lanka, we looked at, again, creating non-agricultural jobs, improving market access, enhancing education. Again, these measures in themselves will reduce the climate burdens. In other words, what we want to convey here is that, yes, we need to take climate measures, you need to make your infrastructure climate-proof, you need to make your agriculture climate smart, but at the same time, let's not give up on the development policies that we actually do. Let's do a good job of development in providing better infrastructure, in enhancing educational opportunities, reducing water stress, creating more jobs in the non-agricultural sector, and so on and so forth. We feel that that itself, to a large extent, will take care of the climate impacts that communities and countries will face. Of course, we need to do these other specific things related to, for example, dealing with extreme events, flooding events, in terms of building embankments or early warning system. Nobody is taking away from those, but at the same time, I think one should not give up on good development, and we feel that that itself will enhance some of the climate burden. So overall, we find that, again, cost of inaction will be highest in severe hotspots. About 800 million people in South Asia will be adversely impacted. States in central, northern, northwestern parts of India will be most impacted. Agriculture household will be, again, we find it most impacted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mani, for that comprehensive presentation of what I think is a very important report. And what you said at the end, a lot of what we need to do for climate is actually designing good policy for development and implementing it. And I don't know what percentage that is, but that is really the key. May I now request Dr. Arvind Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor, for his keynote address. And as usual, I'm sure that we are going to be stimulated, and he's going to give us some ideas, out-of-the-box ideas, as he usually does. Thank you, Arvind.
Thank you, Rajat. Thank you, Muthu. It's a great pleasure to be here to discuss this terrific new piece of research by Muthu and his co-authors at the World Bank. I'm glad that Rajat is calling me the Chief Economic Advisor, because I keep reading of myself as the former Chief Economic Advisor everywhere. So I don't know how many of you are Arsenal fans. An Arsenal fan, Arsene Wenger just retired after many, many years. And in the last last 2-3 weeks of this thing, people were talking about him as if he were already dead. And so a little bit I feel like that, kind of reading my obituaries. And so it's nice to be referred to as the still chief economic advisor. Also, I think Rajat, you're always putting pressure on me to be reactionary, subversive, and all of that. But I'll try and first of all, I want to say that I'm really delighted to be here because I've known Muthu for almost 15-20 years now. And Muthu's been doing a lot of very, very good work on South Asia and environment over many years now. And I owe a particular debt and debt to Muthu because in the first survey, Nick Stern and I were chatting as soon as I took up the job, and the idea struck me that we should, when discussing this with Nick, that the oil price tax increases that we had done were actually very good for climate change. May not be so good politically, but very good for climate change. And actually, Muthu helped us quantify what the carbon equivalent of that was. So in the first survey, Muthu made a great contribution. So thanks a lot, Muthu, for that. So I'm going to organize my remarks today around one, a little bit I'm going to talk about Muthu's this report and try and offer some, just raise some questions about this, particularly since, in the latest survey, two of my colleagues, Parth Khare and Siddharth Hari, did some tremendous work on the impact of agriculture and climate change. And I'm going to try and a little bit push back on some of the findings that Muthu has. So Muthu, if you don't mind, CAs are not just meant to come and say great work, etc. I think we need to have a little bit of a powwow today, and I hope we can have that now. Then I think I want to get into the whole what do we do about it question, so first of all, let me say that this is a terrific report. I think it's reports like this that really contribute to and push the public discourse on what obviously is a very, very important subject. I think we all know how important climate change, but it's always nice to be reminded, like Muthu has done in this report, and lots of new ways of highlighting what are really very important. So I'm going to my first thing. So please don't get me wrong. I think it's a terrific report. I think we should all read it and learn from it. Okay, so but let me then come back and kind of raise a few questions about the report, and in the spirit of just understanding what's going on. Right? So the first point I want to raise, and this is kind of a little bit of a broader methodological question, Muthu, and maybe here we are actually completely wrong and you're completely right. When we did this work for the survey, and I'm going to show you something which is actually fantastic work done by Parth Khare in my team. And here's a kind of broader methodological question. You work with, and these climate change models work with international data, right? There are these standard international databases on temperature and precipitation. So the Indian Meteorological Department is actually extremely generous in sharing its data with us. So it turns out that all these international databases finally rely on data provided by countries themselves. But what happens is that in the case of India, for example, let's say, I'm not going to be exactly precise here, but broadly I'm going to tell you what the situation is. So supposing, for example, a temperature, the IMD measures it at, say, 3,500 or 5,000 stations, daily, whatever. The data we give NOAA is for 50 stations, and then there are all these complicated, gridding procedures, averaging procedures, etc. And then that becomes the kind of received data that all international researchers use. It turns out, and this is the chart we have, it turns out that the international data and the national, the more detailed data, spatially disaggregated data, are very different, both on temperature and on rainfall. You can see there's a big level difference, and you can see also there's a change difference. So this is something I just want to alert all of you researchers to. No, we've not actually pushed through what the consequences of this are for some of the numbers we generate. But I think it's something that we should all be mindful about and certainly do robustness checks based on, because it's tempting for researchers to use these readily available cross-country databases, and by and large I think all of us do that, but I think it's more and more when we do things based which are very important, I think it's worth looking into the data more carefully, and we certainly find that there is a... Now, why is that important? I think in the case of climate change, for example, you said, and this is also, if you look at a lot of the recent work on climate change and GDP, economic activity, etc., a series of papers by Melissa, Dell, and co-authors by the IMF, the general received wisdom is that temperature is going to increase, rainfall, precipitation not clear, and and therefore let's focus on temperature and not on precipitation. We actually find that there is some pattern even on precipitation based on the Indian data, and we also find that the impacts, which I'm going to show you a little bit about, are as important for precipitation as they are for temperature. So that's just about kind of broader technical kind of point I wanted to raise. And I'm sure either you've thought about it. I'd love to hear your reactions to that. But that's something that it does kind of something we need to keep in mind as researchers. The kind of second question I have for you, Muthu, is why did you choose consumption and not GDP itself or some measure of economic activity? I think given that the links from from climate change are predominantly going to be on the supply side. You mentioned health, agricultural productivity, which I'll come to in a second, migration, displacement, etc. You mean for the slow-moving variables? Why is, so my question to you is that this hotspot analysis, which is really very interesting and very useful, how would that change if you used some other measure, not consumption, but actually, some measure of GDP, agriculture, economic activity? How would that change? And are these differences consequential or not, is something that I would love to know more about. I think the third, I think one nice result that comes out if you saw Muthu's map about where the change is happening, it turns out that the largest changes, at least some of the largest changes, are happening in areas which have much lower average temperature. That's why Afghanistan and Nepal, for example, stand to gain. So just by looking at the change, it's not going to tell you where the maximum adverse impact is going to be, because it also depends upon, where you start from. And I think that's, important to keep in mind, that we know that, and it's a very interesting result. I didn't know this, so it's very useful to know that we knew that, for example, Canada and Russia and parts of northern China would stand to gain from climate change, but there's also a South Asia counterpart, which is, Afghanistan and Nepal, which I didn't know about. So it's a very, and also the magnitudes are big. Afghanistan and Nepal, they should be, calling for climate change big time, because they're going to see 7.8% increase in GDP. So then there is the whole, the politics of this is a bit different. Maldives and Afghanistan may have quite different views on climate change, for example, which is very useful to know. Now, one but I'm going to push back a little on one finding here. So you began by categorizing extreme events, the dislocations, sea level rise, exactly, extreme looking sea level rise, and then the slow moving change, right? And then you focused on that, and that's really a nice way of, I think, breaking it up. But here's what we find, which is, I think, really quite interesting, is, and this is work that, again, Parth and Siddharth did for us. Here's, I think, something that really struck me about what's going to happen. Sorry, just give me one. And I'll try and explain it to you. Okay, so this is a really striking finding which applies. So I'm going to try and explain this, and I'm not going to succeed, but just bear with me. So essentially what we tried to do was, what is the impact of temperature change and precipitation change on agricultural yields? And essentially what this is, so just focus on, let's say, the red line, let's say, okay? So essentially on the horizontal axis, it's the deciles of temperature distribution, okay? And on the vertical axis is the impact on yield in percentage terms. Well, actually, look at the green line first, and I'll then tell you about the red line. Essentially, what you find is that what this is saying is that for most of, if you go along the horizontal axis, there's not much of an impact on climate change, except if the temperature increases are extreme. So you find only at the right end where you see sharp declines in yields. And you can see the green line, again, big in decline only at the 9th and 10th decile of the, and these are distributions in terms of temperature change in a particular region relative to the average in that region historically. There's a technical term for it, I don't want to go into it. So essentially what this is saying, Kharif, Rabi, the impacts happen only actually when the temperature increases are large. So in a sense, I'm trying to reconcile, and the same is, and I'm going to come to another finding later. The same thing happens with precipitation as well. You see it's on the left-hand side, that is when precipitation shortfall is the most acute, do you see the biggest declines in yields. So what this is saying is that this process of climate change is highly nonlinear. So if in any particular region, temperature is going up slightly over time, it's not going to have that much of an impact. It's only when temperature goes up very highly or precipitation falls very extremely, then you get all these negative impacts. So how do we reconcile that with the fact that what you're saying is that even with steady increases in temperatures, we will see a lot of impacts, as you say. So I think that, bottom line, I think that what Muthush is telling us is very important, very useful. We should all take it very seriously. But I do wonder about, I'd like to see some more robustness on whether it's robust to the data, whether it's robust to having, different measures, whether it's consumption, if it's production and economic activity rather than consumption, would that change a lot? And also this whole, how do you reconcile non-linearity of effects, which we find very strongly, especially on agriculture, with your more slow-moving change, which is bringing about all these results. I must say I was struck by your hotspot analysis, because I was surprised that, actually maybe I'm misreading it, that parts of, for example, Rajasthan didn't show up as, much more susceptible to this. It was all concentrated, in the heartland. Essentially what it seemed to suggest is that, is it arising because you're looking at consumption, was what thought that was going through my head. Poverty is high, measured in consumption is lower, therefore they are most affected. Whereas if you looked at, for example, if you looked at smallholder agriculture all over India, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Karnataka, everywhere, would you get a different effect or not? So that's something that, I would like to know much more about, and I think that's extremely important. Okay, so that's on the report, on the technical side. I think all of you should read it. You should also think about some of the questions I'm raising and whether, these matter or not. Now we come to, I think, the part where, you want me to be subversive, and so let's see. First, I think that in terms of the responses, let's look at first the what and then the how, right? First of all, I think let me say that I think the Prime Minister's push on renewables, which India has embraced wholeheartedly, shows that I think the Indian government has really committed and internalized climate change and intends to, try and meet the Paris goal, and the stress on renewables is a big part of that. And I think that's it's a major change in the Indian position. I think previously, if you remember the difference between Copenhagen and Paris, I think it was quite significant. In Copenhagen, we were saying, we're poor, et cetera. In Paris, we had really embraced this. We instigated the Solar Alliance. Renewables now a big part. So I think in that sense, it's really I think the policymakers in India have really embraced, addressing climate change as a first order issue. Now, I have to say, Muthu, that now let's focus on the what, and then we'll talk about the how and some more controversial questions that I want to raise at the end. You see, if you then go to your recommendations, right? In some ways, I think what I didn't get out of the report in terms of recommendations is what is it that you would do otherwise that you would not do because of or rather the other way around, what you would do because of climate change that you would not do otherwise. Because all the things that you listed, education, agriculture, et cetera, and of course you very cleverly said, development is the antidote, and so on, and nobody can dispute that, right? So clearly development is very important, because essentially your hotspots are places which have, which are relatively poor, less well, probably more extreme stress, extreme poverty, et cetera. So I think that, therefore, I think in terms of recommendations, I was kind of grasping for what's more concretely that we would need to do because of your analysis, which is very good. What exactly would we need to do that we would not need to do otherwise? Now, let me tell you, or let me now try and give you maybe one or two examples of what, the list is endless. I'm sure you could come up with a much better list, Muthu. But here's one fact I want to highlight here. If you think about India today, over the last 70 years, if I were to ask you what is the share of irrigated agriculture in India, it's less than 50%. I think it's absolutely astonishing that that's the case, right? To my mind, if you look at any plot of India and look at irrigated agriculture and incomes and unirrigated agriculture and incomes, the correlation will be very, very high. So now, here's where I want to then show you these results that we got. Look at this. Now, what I didn't show you, I just showed you, you follow the line, but now look at the difference between the red line and the green line. What we find very strongly is that the impact of these temperature and weather changes are much more severe for unirrigated areas than they are for irrigated areas. So therefore think of this, that you need irrigation not just for and water for higher standards of living in agriculture, but these are also the less vulnerable to climate change. So one immediate policy conclusion that jumps out is that much more of India has to be irrigated. I mean, we need to reach 100% irrigation. But we know that at the same time, climate change and all that we hear is going to lead to serious water shortage kind of issues, right? Water stress, water scarcity. So therefore, I think it seems to me that going forward, that one of the things we need to do, which will have to marry development and climate change, is both increasing the use of irrigation, but at the same time, trying to make the use of water efficiency much more important. Because we cannot compromise with not irrigating our agriculture. Cannot. That's a development outcome that, given agriculture is still so important, everything, we have to, we cannot compromise on standards of living in agriculture, agricultural productivity, but we need to do it mindful of this other thing, which is therefore, what do we do about efficient water use? So that naturally, therefore, translates into a policy agenda of one, pricing. Absolutely, I think that's the wastage that takes place via various kinds of subsidies, power, water subsidies is very important. The other, of course, is how do we encourage the use of sprinkler, water-saving technologies, and how do we spread that around, become actually very, 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 very important. So I think that's kind of one important way of how we can bring this analysis and get it into a more focused agenda that stems from this, rather than a little bit waving our hand and say, let's do education, let's do agriculture, let's do access and so on, which we know, we have to do that. And I mean, the point is very well taken, but I think that we need to do that. So that's on the what, and I think we can go into, I can give you more such examples. But then we come to the how. Now, remember in India, supposing we bought into all of Muthu's analysis, which by and large, I do, and then said, look, there are these hotspots, or if you take my irrigation thing, water thing. Now, many of these things are state subjects in India, whether it's water, agriculture, even the building of amenities, second and third tier are going to be implicated in terms of. So then the big policy question that stems from this, which I think we all need to, if I'm overshooting, let me know. I'll take another just 3, 4, 5 minutes and I'll stop. So I think that it's clear that many of these things are going to implicate the states and involve the states in India. So I think the creative challenge for us is how do the center and the states get together? Because remember, irrigation is all with the states. And Ashok Gulati constantly reminds us that irrigation has been the kind of black hole into which a lot of public money has gone and kind of never come back from the event horizon, as what's his name would say, Stephen Hawking might say. There's nothing comes out of the event horizon. It's all kind of going in. So these are state subjects. So how do you get that? And my own very strong view, and I think Mr. Jaitley, agrees with this 100%, is that I think this cooperative federalism structure that we've created, for example, under the GST, which has, I think, an amazing institutional innovation in India, I think progressively we need to extend that to other sectors. And I think climate change and agriculture are two obvious ways where I think we need to do that. And there are many creative ways of doing this, but I think it cannot, the policy recommendation that, center must do more doesn't fly anymore. The policy recommendation, leave it to the states, also doesn't fly, and therefore we need to have much more cooperative federalism in order to solve these challenges. 2 last points. One is about a broader how question. I don't know how many of you have read Dan Gilbert, the Harvard psychologist. He has a great book. But on climate change, he says that basically the human brain cannot really adapt to slow-moving change. We only react when there is fast-moving change, i.e. crises, et cetera, et cetera. So, for example, it's all, I mean, having been here 3.5, 4 years in government, I can see that, when people say, do reform this, reform that, and then, if the riposte is, well, we're growing at 7.5%, why should we reform? What's the big deal? What would happen if we don't reform, right? And in the case of climate change, that kind of thing is very important. So how do you build incentives, or how do you basically, overcome this basic problem with the human brain, which also then gets translated into the political arena of, mustering, galvanizing action for climate change. I think that's a very, I think, for example, transparency, like, when we put out air quality on a real-time basis, I mean, stuff like that actually really works. So I think we need to think about much more creative ways of, galvanizing and overcoming this basic deficiency of the human brain in this. And I think the more we can think about that, and more those kinds of innovative solutions, I think, are going to be important. Another way of saying it, of course, is that when there's a crisis, don't waste it. When the COSI changes course, that's a time to really act. When we have, floods and so on, I think those are, nobody wants to wish extreme events upon anyone. But when they happen, those are the most natural moments. I think we need to be prepared to act in that. Last point I want to say, maybe a little bit of a controversial point here, is that I think that there is a kind of bigger question here. I suppose underlying this, and I alluded to, I spoke about it in a lecture that I gave, the Darbari Seth Memorial Lecture. I think that, I think the push to renewables is commendable. I think it's really something that, we need to build on. But I do think there is, when you talk about, for example, the climate, the Paris versus the non-Paris, I don't know what you call that, the carbon intensive things. First, I really, India and all South Asia should be always wary about carbon imperialism of the West. I think that's very real. For example, I don't like the phrase decarbonization. I think we should talk about de-emissionization, which I'm very happy with, but decarbonization I don't like. Because I do think there's a broader issue of, yes, renewables, etc., but how do we make our endowments, for example, of coal, how do we make them greener and cleaner, I think has to be on top of any, not national, but international agenda going forward. I think that I think we should not lose sight of, that there is carbon imperialism, that people around the world going left, right, and things saying, abandon coal, we will not finance coal projects, the World Bank is not financing coal projects. I think we need a concerted effort to make coal, and I think the only way to reconcile, climate change, development, renewables, fossil fuels, is in fact, of course, to have more renewables, and this, think about whether we should be, how much we should subsidize renewables versus, get the costing of the social pricing of renewables and carbon right. And I think the social costing of carbon should include the kind of stranded assets we may create in many parts of the economy. So I think we need to get that right in a way. And I think we need international cooperation to get, for example, I'm super excited for, because whenever we talk about greening coal and cleaning coal, people always come back and say, CCS, very expensive, not working. 2 points. One is that CCS, by the way, is carbon capture and storage. That's the way you make, in some ways, coal cleaner. I think that people say it hasn't, it has limitations, and my answer, of course, is that it depends upon how much effort you put into it. The more you can put in, the better it'll be. And second, a month ago, or even 2-3 weeks ago, there's this new paper in Nature or something which says that there have been some very exciting new developments in CCS technology and so on. So I think that to conclude, hearty congratulations to Muthu and World Bank for a terrific report. I think it's a huge, very valuable contribution. But I would, like us to reflect more on some of the things along the lines. Maybe you have very good responses. Maybe there are other questions as well. But in terms of responding to it, I think we have to think about the whole what needs to be done, how it needs to be done in India, where you have center state things. How do we overcome the Dan Gilbert challenge about the human brain? How do we reconcile, for countries like India, renewables and carbon? So these are some of the kind of big issues on this. I've spoken too much. Thank you very much, and congratulations, Muthu, once again.
Thank you, Arvind. It's always, as I keep saying, it's always such a great pleasure to listen to you. And what you call subversive, I called out-of-the-box thinking. Since Arvind has raised some crucial questions and critical questions, and we do have a panel discussion a little later after a short tea break, but I'm going to let Mani, respond briefly to some of the questions or challenges that Arvind has posed. And I think there's somebody on the floor who's just sent me a note that he has answers to these questions, so I'm going to let him have 2 minutes and provide those answers. But first, to Mani, please. But there will be no question answer in this session, please. Just one intervention by a gentleman who sent me a note, and we'll postpone the questions to after the panel discussion. Mani.
Okay. Thanks, Rajat. Thanks, Arvind. Extremely useful comments. I'm glad that you came and you were able to review these findings. And of course, hope you'll have a chance to read the report, because we have some more details than what I presented here. But just to respond to a few of your comments about the data and modeling. So the way we did was, for historic climate analysis, we used the country-specific data. We got it from the country, from the IMD. And then what we did was we used climate modeling. As I mentioned before, we commissioned a group of climate scientists who then gave us the best climate models that fit South Asia based on their historic performance. In other words, they selected those models that they reanalyzed. So to that extent, we were reasonably comfortable that they were quite useful. In terms of temperature and rainfall, I think, I agree with you in the sense that our study seems to convey the message that temperature is driving everything. And again, the problem to some extent is with climate models. They're not still, scientists cannot tell us with great deal of confidence the precipitation patterns and where and how and so on and so forth. And also the climate models still cannot tell us anything about future extreme events in terms of where the flooding will happen, where the extreme events will happen. So given the limitations of the climate models, we did what we could in terms of the projections. We entirely agree with you, policy agenda. We were just scratching the surface, I think. We feel that this is a start of a dialogue. We feel that this is something that we can now use to start